A teacher climbs onto his desk, looks out over the classroom, and tells his students to change the way they see the world. Then he invites them to do the same. One by one, they stand up, step onto their own desks, and look at the room from a height they've never tried before. It's a small, quiet act, and it changes everything. This is Dead Poets Society, released on June 2nd, 1989, directed by Peter Weir and starring Robin Williams as John Keating, an English teacher at a strict 1950s boys' boarding school who inspires his students to seize the day, think for themselves, and fall in love with poetry. It launched the careers of Ethan Hawke and Robert Sean Leonard, and it remains one of the most emotionally powerful films about teaching, youth, and the cost of courage ever made. But it very nearly didn't exist. Disney wanted a musical. The first director was fired, and the man the studio needed to star in it simply didn't turn up. 20 facts, counting down. Fact 20. Disney originally wanted to call it Sultans of Strut. Before Dead Poets Society became a beloved drama about poetry and rebellion, the studio had a very different vision for it. According to production accounts, Disney at one stage considered renaming the film Sultans of Strut and reimagining it as a coming-of-age musical in the vein of Fame. Teenagers dancing through their self-discovery rather than whispering Walt Whitman in a cave. Think about that. The quiet, devastating film about boys reciting poetry by candlelight was nearly a song and dance number. It never happened, and the film kept its original title. But somewhere in a studio filing cabinet, the ghost of a very different movie, one with choreography, is gathering dust. Fact 19. John Keating was based on a real teacher in Tennessee. John Keating was not invented from nothing. Screenwriter Tom Schulman based the character on real teachers from his own adolescence, most directly Samuel F. Pickering, Jr., who taught Schulman's sophomore English class at Montgomery Bell Academy, a prep school in Nashville, Tennessee. Schulman described Pickering as eccentric, unpredictable, and capable of making literature feel electric and alive. Most of the film's characters were modeled on people Schulman actually knew. Pickering himself, when asked about his connection to Keating years later, was characteristically modest, telling a reporter, "Whatever of me is in that character has got to be small." But Schulman knew the spark had come from that classroom. One real teacher, one lasting impression, and an Oscar-winning screenplay. Fact 18. The first director was fired and the sets were burned. Dead Poets Society had a spectacularly chaotic false start. The original director attached was Jeff Kanu, best known for Revenge of the Nerds, a tonal mismatch with a thoughtful boarding school drama. Kanu wanted Liam Neeson to play Keating. The studio wanted Robin Williams. Williams never quite committed, according to screenwriter Tom Schulman. Sets were built near Atlanta, the film was prepped, and on the first day of shooting, Robin Williams simply didn't show up. He'd never formally agreed to work with that director. Disney pulled the plug immediately, and in a dramatic flourish, the abandoned Atlanta sets were actually burned. The production has dailies of the fire, a clean slate, and a very expensive pile of ash. Fact 17. Dustin Hoffman was briefly attached to direct and star. After the Kanu disaster, there was a brief, fascinating chapter. Before Peter Weir came aboard, the Oscar-winning actor Dustin Hoffman signed on, not just to play John Keating, but to direct the film as well. It would have been a radically different movie. Hoffman in the role would have brought a coiled, method actor intensity utterly unlike Robin Williams' warmth. But scheduling conflicts and disagreements about the production timeline derailed the plan, and Hoffman departed. Had he stayed, the world would have gotten a darker, more internally wound version of the story. Instead, the project passed to the Australian director Peter Weir, fresh off Witness and the Mosquito Coast, and the film found the delicate, reverent tone it needed. Fact 16. Peter Weir deliberately kept Robin Williams quiet. Williams's gift was explosive, uncontrollable comic energy, and Peter Weir's genius was knowing when to turn it down. According to the production's own accounts, Williams improvised only about 15% of his dialogue in Dead Poets Society, a radical restraint compared to, say, Mrs. Doubtfire. Weir and Williams agreed early on that Keating's power came from stillness and conviction, not riffing. So Weir held Williams back for most of the shoot. Then on one unscheduled afternoon, Weir gave Williams permission to cut loose entirely. and that's the day Williams improvised his John Wayne and Marlon Brando impressions in front of the class. Weir later described it simply: when Robin's improvising, he gives off an electric charge you can feel. Restraint made the moments of freedom land harder. Fact 15. Ethan Hawke was terrified, and it's in the film. Ethan Hawke plays Todd Anderson, the painfully shy new boy who can barely bring himself to speak in class, and much of Todd's raw vulnerability was real. Hawke was a young, relatively inexperienced actor, visibly nervous and overwhelmed by the scale of the production and the force of Robin Williams' personality. That anxiety fed directly into Todd's character. In the famous scene where Keating forces Todd to improvise a poem in front of the whole class, pulling words out of him, refusing to let him sit down, Williams was encouraged to push Hawke genuinely hard, and Hawke's flustered, near-tearful response is partly real emotion breaking through. The result is one of the most moving scenes in the film. A young actor's actual fear became a character's breakthrough. Fact 14. The film was shot at a real boarding school in Delaware. The stately, imposing corridors and grounds of the fictional Welton Academy were not a Hollywood set. Dead Poets Society was filmed on location at St. Andrew's School, a real boarding school in Middletown, Delaware. The school's ivy-covered stone buildings, manicured lawns, and chapel gave the film its authentic atmosphere of cloistered privilege and quiet pressure. Filming took place in the winter months, and the bare trees and gray Delaware skies lent the production an appropriately somber beauty. The real students at St. Andrews were away during filming, but several later noted how strange it was to see their own hallways and classrooms transformed into a 1950s prep school on screen. The location wasn't just a backdrop, it became one of the film's most important characters. Fact 13. Peter Weir bonded the young actors like a real boarding school. To make the on-screen friendships feel real, Peter Weir used an unusual strategy. He treated the young cast like actual boarding school students. Before filming began, Weir had the young actors, Ethan Hawke, Robert Sean Leonard, Josh Charles, Gail Hansen, and the others, live, eat, and spend time together, creating a genuine closeness that translated to screen. He also ran them through rehearsal exercises and discussions designed to build trust and shared experience. By the time the cameras rolled, the boys' camaraderie was authentic. They weren't just acting like friends in a boarding school. They had genuinely become a tight-knit group, away from home, sharing something intense. Several of the actors have said those weeks were among the most formative experiences of their young lives. Fact 12. Robin Williams called the boys the real stars of the film. For all his screen presence, Robin Williams understood something essential about Dead Poets Society. It wasn't really his movie. In interviews during the film's release, Williams was careful to point out that John Keating is a catalyst, not the center. The real story of this film is the boys, Williams said. Keating lights a fire, but it's the students, Todd, Neil, Knox, Charlie, who carry it and who pay the price. Watch the film again with that framing and you'll see how deliberately Williams holds back, giving scenes to the younger actors, letting their faces carry the emotion. It's a generous, quietly disciplined performance from a man famous for dominating every room. Williams later called Peter Weir one of the best directors he ever worked with. Fact 11. The screenplay won the Oscar, and the film was nominated for Best Picture. Dead Poets Society was a genuine awards contender. Tom Schulman's screenplay, the first he ever sold to Hollywood, won the Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, a remarkable achievement for a first-time screenwriter. The film also received nominations for Best Picture, Best Director for Peter Weir, and Best Actor for Robin Williams, though it won only the Writing Award. The year was stacked. Best Picture went to Driving Miss Daisy, and Best Actor went to Daniel Day-Lewis for My Left Foot. But the screenplay win was richly deserved. Schulman had turned his own schoolboy memories into a script that made audiences laugh, cry, and quote Latin. A prep school kid from Nashville, writing about the teacher who changed his life, took home the biggest writing prize in the industry. Fact 10. Carpe Diem entered everyday language because of this film. John Keating's signature phrase, Carpe Diem, seize the day, boys, make your lives extraordinary, was already an ancient Latin saying, but Dead Poets Society is the reason most people know it. Before 1989, Carpe Diem was a dusty piece of classroom Horace. After the film, it was everywhere, on posters, t-shirts, graduation speeches, and tattoos. Williams delivers the words early in the film, standing his boys in front of a glass cabinet of old-school photographs, asking them to lean in and listen to the dead. It became one of the most quoted lines in modern cinema, and it fundamentally changed the way a generation talked about ambition, mortality, and living fully. One ancient phrase, spoken by one fictional teacher, entered the permanent vocabulary of millions. Fact 9. The score was composed by the man who scored Lawrence of Arabia. The film's music, tender, sweeping, faintly melancholy, was composed by Maurice Jarre, one of the most decorated film composers of the 20th century. Jarre had won 3 Academy Awards, most famously for David Lean's Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, 2 of the grandest epics ever made. For Dead Poets Society, he brought that same emotional scale to something far more intimate, a story about boys and books and a teacher who believed in them. The result is a score that makes small, quiet moments, a walk across a misty campus, a whispered poem in a cave, feel vast and important. Jarre understood that the film's emotions were epic even if its setting was a classroom. Few composers could make poetry feel that large. Fact 8. Robert Sean Leonard's performance anchors the film's tragedy. The emotional center of the film is not Keating. It's Neil Perry, the bright, passionate student who discovers a love of acting, defies his tyrannical father, and meets a devastating end. Neil is played by Robert Sean Leonard in a performance of extraordinary sensitivity. Leonard makes you feel every ounce of Neil's joy on stage and every ounce of his despair at home. His arc is the story's moral engine. It shows what happens when a system crushes the very thing a teacher has tried to set free. Leonard would go on to a distinguished career, including years as Dr. Wilson on the TV series House, but this is the performance that announced him, and it remains one of the great tragic turns in coming-of-age cinema. Fact 7. The cave scenes were shot in a real cave near the school. When Keating's students revive the secret Dead Poets Society, they meet at night in a cave hidden in the woods, reading poetry aloud by candlelight. Those scenes were filmed in a real cave located on the grounds near St. Andrew's School. The production used genuine candlelight and natural rock to create the atmosphere, warm, conspiratorial, slightly dangerous, that makes those sequences so memorable. The cave becomes a kind of sanctuary, the one place the boys can be themselves, away from Welton's rigid rules. It's a beautifully simple location, no special effects, no elaborate set, just stone walls, flickering flames, and young voices discovering that poetry can be an act of defiance. The plainness of the setting is exactly what gives it its power. Fact 6. The film made $236 million on a modest budget. Dead Poets Society was a quiet literary drama about a boarding school, not an obvious blockbuster, but audiences turned out in enormous numbers. Made on a budget of around $16 million, it earned roughly $236 million worldwide, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 1989 and proving that a thoughtful, emotionally honest drama could compete with big-budget spectacles. Word of mouth carried it for months. Families went together, teachers showed it in classrooms, and it became one of those rare films that crossed every demographic. A movie about poetry and Latin and standing on desks turned into a genuine cultural phenomenon, and a reminder that audiences are always hungrier for real feeling than studios tend to assume. Fact 5. The film launched at least 2 major Hollywood careers. Before Dead Poets Society, Ethan Hawke and Robert Sean Leonard were unknowns. After it, both became stars with long, distinguished careers ahead of them. Hawke would go on to appear in films like Before Sunrise, Training Day, and Boyhood, earning multiple Oscar nominations. Leonard took a different path, building a celebrated career on the stage and eventually becoming one of the leads of the long-running TV hit house. Josh Charles, who plays the romantic Knox Overstreet, also found lasting success, most notably as Will Gardner on The Good Wife. The film didn't just tell a story about young men finding their voices, it genuinely launched theirs. For a generation of actors, the set at St. Andrews was a real-life version of Keating's classroom. Fact 4, The "O Captain, My Captain" poem is by Walt Whitman. John Keating's students call him "O Captain, My Captain" throughout the film, and that phrase comes from one of the most famous poems in American literature. Walt Whitman wrote it in 1865 as an elegy for President Abraham Lincoln after his assassination, using a ship's captain as a metaphor for the fallen leader. Keating encourages his students to address him this way as a gesture of irreverence and affection. It's a fitting choice. Whitman's poem is about honoring a leader who has guided others safely through a storm, but doesn't survive the journey himself. In the context of the film's story, the parallel becomes heartbreaking. By the final scene, when the boys call out those words one last time, it carries the full weight of everything the film has put them and you through. Fact 3. The desk-standing finale was not in the original script. The film's most iconic image, the students standing on their desk one by one as Mr. Keating leaves the classroom for the last time, was not in Tom Schulman's original screenplay. According to production accounts, the scene evolved during filming, shaped by Peter Weir's instinct for visual emotion. Weir understood that the moment needed no dialogue beyond 3 words. Todd Anderson, the shyest boy in the class, is the first to stand, whispering, "O Captain, my Captain." Others follow. It's a scene of quiet, unmistakable defiance, each boy choosing in that moment to honor what Keating taught them, despite everything. Weir built it from the film's own internal logic rather than a scripted blueprint, and it became the single most powerful image in the movie. Fact 2. The real teacher never quite recognized himself in the film. Samuel Pickering Jr., the real English teacher who inspired John Keating, watched the finished film, and his reaction was characteristically dry. He admitted he found parts of it moving, but he never fully accepted the connection. "Whatever of me is in that character has got to be small," he told a reporter. "I was a kid and he was a child, 23 years ago. How much of me could there be in the movie?" It's a perfectly Pickering-like response, modest, slightly bemused, refusing to take credit. But Tom Schulman has always been clear. Without that one teacher in that one Nashville classroom, this film would not exist. Great teachers often don't know the full extent of what they've set in motion. That, in a way, is the whole point of the movie. Fact 1. The standing ovation is for every teacher who ever changed a life. We end where we began, on the desks. When Todd Anderson stands, when the other boys follow, when Robin Williams' face crumbles into something between grief and gratitude as he whispers, "Thank you, boys." It isn't just a movie scene, it's become a cultural touchstone for what teaching at its best can mean. The image has been borrowed, parodied, and referenced countless times, but it keeps its power because it speaks to something real. The memory of one teacher at one moment who saw something in you before you saw it in yourself. That's why Dead Poets Society endures, not because it's about poetry or rebellion or a 1950s prep school, but because almost everyone watching has a Keating of their own, Carpe Diem, and that's 20 facts about Dead Poets Society. A burned set, a reluctant star, a shy teenager's real terror, and the quietest, most devastating standing ovation in film. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for a brand new countdown every week and tell us which classic we should seize next. Oh, Captain, my Captain.